Welcome to History Teller YT, where the untold voices of the past come alive. Today, we uncover a powerful story of resilience, struggle, and survival. The history of the Subanen people, the original stewards of the Zamboanga Peninsula. For centuries, they lived along fertile rivers and valleys, guided by ancestral traditions that saw the land not as property, but as life itself. Yet their world was forever changed, first by foreign colonizers who dismissed their rights, then by governments that opened their homeland to settlers, logging and mining. The Subanen were pushed from the fertile lowlands into the mountains, branded as squatters on their own land. This is not just a story of loss. It is also a story of courage, of cultural survival, and of a people who refused to vanish despite a century of injustice. As we journey through treaties, laws, resettlement programs, and modern struggles, you'll see how the Subanen's fight mirrors the global struggle of indigenous peoples for dignity and recognition. Stay with us, because this history is not only about the past, it holds lessons for our future. This is the story of why the Subanen lost their land, and how they continue to fight for it today. The Subanen are among the oldest indigenous peoples of Mindanao, inhabiting the Zamboanga Peninsula long before the arrival of Spaniards, Americans, or settlers from Luzon and Visayan. Their name itself comes from the root words Suba, meaning river, and Nen, meaning people, making them literally the people of the river. This name reflects their deep connection to waterways, fertile lowlands, and valleys where they cultivated rice, root crops, and fruit-bearing trees for countless generations. To understand the gravity of their dispossession, we must first picture how their world looked before colonization. Imagine riverbanks lined with small farming villages, trading routes extending to coastal towns, and Subanen families thriving in harmony with the land. They followed oral traditions and communal ownership, meaning that land was not sold or fenced off. It was considered a shared heritage, passed from one generation to the next. For them, the earth was sacred, not something to be bought or commodified. Yet this worldview would clash violently with Western legal concepts of private property. Over time, what had always been theirs became contested, and later stripped away through laws they never wrote and agreements they never signed. By looking back at their identity and homeland, we begin to understand the painful injustice that followed. The Zamboanga Peninsula is a land of rolling hills, fertile plains, and rivers that empty into the rich fishing grounds of the Sulu Sea. Before colonization, this region provided the Subanen with abundant resources. They practiced shifting cultivation, grew rice and corn, and gathered forest products such as rattan and honey for trade. Socially, their communities were organized around the datu, or village head, who was chosen for wisdom and fairness rather than sheer power. Decision-making often involved consensus, showing a communal spirit that valued harmony. Spirituality was deeply tied to the environment. They believed in unseen beings dwelling in forests, rivers, and mountains, whom they honored through rituals led by shamans. When outsiders later described the Subanen as backward or primitive, it ignored the sophistication of their ecological knowledge and sustainable living. For centuries, they lived relatively undisturbed, but as the Philippines was pulled into global colonial networks, the Subanen way of life came under threat. The Spanish Empire nominally claimed sovereignty over Mindanao, but their presence in Zamboanga was limited mostly to military forts. It was not until the Americans took over in 1898 that the Subanen would face sweeping transformations that would tear apart their relationship with land. To the Subanen, land was life, but to colonial powers, land was wealth and resource. When Spain lost the Philippines to the United States through the Treaty of Paris in 1898, the Subanen were not consulted. Their fate was decided in distant capitals thousands of miles away. Suddenly, their ancestral domain was classified as part of a new colonial possession. The Americans introduced the idea that land must be proven through documents, titles, and surveys. This legalistic framework clashed with the Subanen worldview, where proof of ownership was communal memory, ancestral presence, and tradition. As we will see in later parts, the Public Land Act of 1903 became the instrument by which untitled lands, effectively all Subanen lands, were declared public domain. But before that, the stage had already been set. Their homeland was no longer just their home. It had become territory for outsiders to administer, exploit, and eventually resettle. This marked the beginning of a long historical process that would push the Subanen from the fertile lowlands into the harsher mountain interiors, stripping them not only of land, but also of dignity, opportunity, and cultural space. Their story is a microcosm of what happened to many Lumad peoples across Mindanao. Yet each community's pain carries its own uniqueness. For the Subanen, the arrival of outside powers was not just history. It was the first step in losing the land that defined who they were. When Spain lost the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines, together with Guam and Puerto Rico, was handed over to the United States for $20 million. This was formalized in the Treaty of Paris signed on December 10, 1898. On paper, it was just another geopolitical transaction, a moment when empires redrew maps to reflect power shifts. But for the Subanen and other Mindanao peoples, it was a thunderbolt that shattered their world without them even knowing. No Subanen leader sat at that negotiation table in Paris. No one asked their consent. Their ancestral rivers, valleys, and mountains, lived in, cultivated, and honored for countless generations, were suddenly classified as territory of the United States. To the Subanen, this was incomprehensible. How could foreigners claim ownership of a homeland they had never tilled, never guarded, never prayed over? Yet this is how colonialism worked. Legal documents signed by outsiders carried more weight than centuries of lived tradition. The Subanen, who once had autonomy in their ancestral domain, woke up one day to find themselves subjects of a foreign empire they had never heard of. This treaty, celebrated in Washington and Madrid, marked the start of a long chain of dispossession. It was the moment the Subanen were written out of the legal ownership of their own land, even before they knew what land laws meant. After acquiring the Philippines, the United States quickly realized that Mindanao, with its fertile plains and rich natural resources, was a jewel worth exploiting. Unlike Luzon and Visayan, which were already crowded with people and farms, Mindanao was seen by Americans as underpopulated and unused. This colonial myth ignored the fact that indigenous groups like the Subanen, Tejere, Manobo, and Moro had long cultivated, managed, and lived on these lands. For Americans, Mindanao was the new frontier, much like the West had been for settlers in the United States during the 19th century. They envisioned it as a vast agricultural colony where modern farming, plantations, and logging could flourish. To justify their plans, they branded indigenous systems of landholding as primitive and non-legal. The Subanen's oral traditions, where land rights were passed through collective memory and social recognition, were not considered valid. Only written titles, notarized and surveyed according to American standards, would count. This mindset would soon be codified in the Public Land Act of 1903, which became the most devastating law for indigenous peoples across Mindanao. For the Subanen, this law transformed their homeland into public land, available to anyone who could file a claim, except them, since they had no papers. The colonial vision of Mindanao as empty space for settlement was a deliberate erasure of the Subanen presence, an early act of historical violence committed not with weapons, but with legal codes. The Treaty of Paris and the American colonial vision were more than symbolic. They laid the groundwork for legal dispossession. For centuries, the Subanen had lived with a different relationship to land. They did not divide it into plots or register it with a government office. Their proof of ownership was ancestral continuity. But the Americans introduced surveys, registries, and paperwork, and without these, Subanen lands could not be defended in court. Imagine a Subanen elder standing before an American administrator, explaining that his family had lived by the river since his great-grandfather's time. The administrator would nod, then ask, "Do you have a title?" Without one, the land was classified as unowned. Overnight, thousands of hectares of fertile lowlands were marked on maps as public domain. These maps, drawn in Manila and approved in Washington, ignored the living reality of Subanen villages. The people who had planted rice, fished in rivers, and guarded sacred sites suddenly became squatters in the eyes of the law. This was not just a bureaucratic trick. It was the start of displacement. Once their lands were declared public, they became open to homesteaders, corporations, and logging companies. The Subanen were left vulnerable, watching as outsiders took over spaces that had defined their identity for generations. It was the beginning of a painful journey, from rightful stewards of ancestral domains to marginalized minorities pushed into mountain margins. In 1903, the American colonial government passed one of the most consequential laws in Philippine history, Act No. 926, known as the Public Land Act. To most Filipinos at the time, it might have seemed like a distant policy written in Manila, but to the Subanen and other Lumad groups, it was the sharpest knife that cut through their ancestral ownership. The law declared that all lands in the Philippines without formal written titles were to be considered part of the public domain. In other words, unless a person could present a legal paper proving private ownership, the state claimed it as its own. This single clause erased centuries of indigenous occupancy and stewardship in one stroke. The Subanen, who had always relied on oral tradition, collective memory, and customary law, had no documents that matched American standards. Their deeds were the stories of ancestors, the presence of burial grounds, and the continuity of farming on the same riverbanks. But the colonial authorities did not recognize such evidence. To them, only notarized titles registered with the government were valid. The law did allow Filipinos to apply for homesteads, but the process required literacy, money, and access to government offices, things most Subanen did not have. As a result, Subanen lands, fertile valleys, riversides, and forests were reclassified overnight as public lands, open for homesteading, sale, or lease to migrants and corporations. This marked the start of systematic legal dispossession, where people who had never lost a war suddenly lost their homeland through the stroke of a pen. One might ask, why didn't the Americans simply respect Subanen customary law? After all, these communities had been occupying their lands long before colonization. The answer lies in the worldview of colonial administrators. For them, law had to be written, codified, and backed by surveys and registries. Oral traditions, no matter how old or consistent, were seen as unreliable. This dismissal was not accidental. It was rooted in a racial hierarchy where Western legal systems were considered superior to indigenous ones. By denying the validity of Subanen practices, the Americans created a legal vacuum where only outsiders could benefit. Imagine a Subanen elder speaking of his people's right to a fertile valley they had farmed for generations, only to be told, without papers, you have no proof. This was a cruel irony, because the Subanen did not need paper to know their land. They had lived on it for centuries. But the law was structured in such a way that their lack of titles was seen not as evidence of continuity, but as absence of ownership. The result was devastating. Subanen lands became available to anyone who could navigate the new system. Migrants from Luzon and Visayan, often with government support, filed claims and were granted titles. Logging companies and plantations secured leases. The Subanen, meanwhile, were pushed further upland into areas with rocky soils and thinner forests. In this sense, the Public Land Act was more than just a law. It was a weapon disguised as legal reform, cutting the Subanen away from their ancestral lifeblood. Once the Public Land Act came into effect, the Zamboanga Peninsula and other parts of Mindanao became magnets for migration. At first, individual homesteaders from Visayas and Luzon arrived, drawn by the promise of cheap, fertile land. They came with papers, surveys, and government backing. The Subanen, watching these strangers settle on lands their families had long occupied, often could not resist. Some resisted quietly, by retreating into the hills rather than engaging in open conflict. Others tried to coexist, but in the eyes of the law, they were treated as squatters on their own lands. Logging operations also began to expand. The American government, hungry for timber and agricultural exports, opened up Mindanao's forests to concessions. This meant that even lands not settled by migrants were taken over by companies with permits. To the Subanen, these forests were sacred and life-sustaining. To outsiders, they were resources to be harvested. The imbalance of power was stark. One side had centuries of belonging, the other side had legal documents backed by the colonial state. Slowly but surely, the Subanen were squeezed out of their fertile valleys. Their economy, once based on farming and trading along rivers, weakened as they were pushed into more marginal lands. This early wave of displacement set the stage for even larger settlement programs in the 1930s and 1940s, when a Philippine Commonwealth government would take over and accelerate the influx of Christian settlers. By then, the groundwork had already been laid. The Public Land Act had turned Subanen territory into public land, and the Subanen themselves into strangers in their own homeland. By 1935, the Philippines transitioned into the Commonwealth government under President Manuel L. Quezon. Although the Americans still maintained control, the Commonwealth was designed as a preparation stage for full independence. For many Filipinos in Luzon and Visayas, this period was celebrated as a step towards self-rule. But for the Subanen and other indigenous peoples in Mindanao, it meant something else: the continuation and even acceleration of land loss. The Americans had already set the legal foundation with the Public Land Act of 1903. Now, Filipino leaders adopted the same legal framework but applied it with greater urgency. Quezon and his administration saw Mindanao as the land of promise, a vast frontier that could solve landlessness and poverty in the North and Central Philippines. This vision, however, ignored the reality that Mindanao was not empty. It was the ancestral home of the Subanen, Manobo, Higanon, Moro, and many other groups. The Commonwealth government's policies treated these peoples as obstacles to development rather than rightful owners. With independence on the horizon, leaders wanted to secure Mindanao as an integral part of the new nation. To them, the best way was to flood it with settlers from Luzon and Visayas, thereby ensuring demographic control. For the Subanen, this meant that dispossession was no longer just about colonial outsiders. It was now perpetuated by fellow Filipinos, backed by laws and institutions that legitimized the transfer of their lands. In 1939, Quezon established the National Land Settlement Administration, NLSA, one of the most ambitious resettlement programs in Philippine history. Its stated purpose was noble: to give landless peasants from overpopulated Luzon and Visayas a chance at a better life in Mindanao. The government selected fertile lands in Cotabato, Bukidnon, Coronadal Valley, and Zamboanga Peninsula for resettlement projects. Migrants were not only granted land titles, but also provided with farming tools, seeds, housing materials, and even transportation. It was a complete package designed to guarantee their success. The Subanen, however, were excluded from these benefits. They were never consulted about the use of their lands, nor were they considered as rightful beneficiaries. Instead, they watched as truckloads of settlers arrived, guided by government surveyors who parceled out land that the Subanen had cultivated for generations. What made this particularly painful was the unequal playing field. Migrants had state recognition and legal documents, while the Subanen had none. The government treated the indigenous peoples as if they were invisible, present on the land physically, but absent in the law. The NLSA institutionalized a system where outsiders gained ownership, while the original inhabitants were driven further into marginal spaces. Thus, while Luzon and Visayan settlers celebrated new beginnings, the Subanen faced the bitter reality of displacement, losing fertile river valleys and trade routes that had sustained them for centuries. The influx of settlers under the NLSA created profound consequences for the Subanen. First, it altered the demographic balance of Mindanao. In many areas of the Zamboanga Peninsula, settlers quickly outnumbered the Subanen population, reshaping local politics, economies, and cultures. Where the Subanen once traded freely with coastal communities, they now found themselves marginalized, excluded from markets dominated by settlers. Second, the fertile lowlands that had been the backbone of Subanen agriculture were now occupied by new arrivals. The Subanen were pushed upland into more rugged terrain with thinner soils and fewer resources. Farming became more difficult, and their surplus for trade dwindled. Third, the psychological impact was heavy. To be told that one is a squatter on one's ancestral domain is more than an insult. It is a stripping of dignity. Generations of Subanen, who had always seen themselves as caretakers of the land, were suddenly treated as illegal occupants. Finally, the Commonwealth period deepened the cycle of marginalization. Children grew up without access to fertile land. Elders saw sacred sites fenced off or destroyed, and whole communities became dependent on subsistence, farming in less hospitable areas. By the time World War II interrupted these programs, the damage had already been done. The Subanen's grip on their ancestral lowlands had been broken, and their displacement into the mountains was well underway. This pattern would only intensify after Philippine independence in 1946, when successive governments continued the drive to resettle Mindanao with migrants, sealing the Subanen's marginalization. If Roxas laid the foundation for post-independence resettlement, President Ramon Magsaysay expanded it with vigor. Magsaysay, often remembered as the champion of the masses, saw Mindanao as the best solution to the problem of landless peasants in Luzon and Visayas. In the 1950s, his program Land for the Landless became one of the most aggressive settlement drives in Philippine history. Entire communities of Visayan migrants were transported to Mindanao with government support, echoing the Commonwealth's NLSA policies, but on an even larger scale. These settlers were given not only land titles, but also logistical help, seeds, and tools to succeed. To many peasants from the north, it was a dream come true. But for the Subanen, it was another nightmare. The program ignored their existence, treating their ancestral lands as vacant property ready to be distributed. The imbalance was glaring. Settlers arrived with papers that guaranteed ownership, while the Subanen, who had tilled and protected the same soil for centuries, were labeled as illegal occupants. Moreover, Magsaysay's administration promoted logging concessions, allowing corporations to cut down forests in Zamboanga and Misamis Occidental. These forests had spiritual and ecological importance to the Subanen, but under the state's logic, they were merely economic resources. Many Subanen communities were displaced twice, first by settlers, then by logging companies. What is often remembered as a golden era of agrarian reform for some Filipinos is remembered as another wave of dispossession for the Subanen. Their displacement became more permanent, forcing them deeper into mountainous interiors where survival grew increasingly difficult. The settlement policies of Roxas and Magsaysay created ripple effects that reshaped Subanen society. One major impact was demographic change. By the late 1950s, settlers from Visayas and Luzon began to outnumber the Subanen in several municipalities of the Zamboanga Peninsula. This demographic imbalance shifted political power. Local governments, once influenced by Subanen leaders, were now dominated by migrant officials who prioritized the interests of settler communities. Economically, the Subanen became increasingly marginalized. With fertile lands gone, they relied on subsistence farming in mountainous areas with poor soils. This reduced their ability to participate in trade and made poverty more entrenched. Socially, many Subanen children were left without access to schools, which were built in settler communities rather than indigenous areas. Culturally, the erosion of ancestral domains weakened traditional practices tied to rivers, lowlands, and sacred groves. Rituals that required access to specific sites became harder to perform. Even their identity was stigmatized. Being called a lumad or Subanen often carried connotations of backwardness in a society increasingly dominated by settler culture. By the end of the 1950s, the Subanen were no longer just dispossessed landowners. They were systematically excluded from the economic, political, and cultural life of the new republic. For them, independence had delivered not liberation, but a harsher reality of marginalization and invisibility. When Ferdinand Marcos rose to power in 1965, he presented himself as a modernizer who would transform the Philippines into a prosperous nation. For him, Mindanao was central to that vision. He often described the island as the country's last frontier, a vast, fertile land waiting to be developed into plantations, farms, and industrial hubs. Marcos's government promoted large-scale agricultural colonization, opening up lands in Bukidnon, Cotabato, Davao, and Zamboanga Peninsula to investors and settlers. His administration encouraged corporations, both local and foreign, to establish plantations for crops like bananas, pineapples, and later rubber and palm oil. In speeches, Marcos justified these moves by claiming they would bring progress, employment, and national food security. Yet for the Subanen, this rhetoric of development was a mask for dispossession. Their lands, already reduced by earlier settlement programs, were now being carved out for agribusiness. Forests were logged at unprecedented rates, rivers polluted by industrial activity, and fertile lowlands fenced off for commercial crops. What Marcos celebrated as national development, the Subanen experienced as the further erosion of their ancestral lifeways. Once again, the state saw them not as rightful owners, but as obstacles to progress. The irony was bitter. While outsiders gained wealth and profit, the Subanen were forced deeper into poverty. The Marcos period was also marked by the rise of logging and mining concessions across Mindanao. Multinational corporations, granted permits by the government, cleared thousands of hectares of forest in Zamboanga del Norte and Misamis Occidental, areas long considered sacred by the Subanen. These forests were not just sources of timber. They were homes to spirits, burial grounds, and reservoirs of biodiversity that sustained their communities. The arrival of logging companies brought bulldozers and trucks that scar the landscape. In some areas, entire Subanen villages were displaced to make way for concessions. Mining also expanded, most notoriously in Canatuan, where later decades would see gold and copper extraction displace more Subanen families. At the same time, plantation agriculture flourished. Corporations like Del Monte and Dole established vast banana and pineapple estates in Mindanao, with ripple effects reaching Zamboanga. While these companies provided jobs, they also created unequal power relations. Subanen who became plantation workers often received meager wages and lost their autonomy as food producers. Instead of planting their own rice or corn, many found themselves dependent on buying food with wages earned from backbreaking labor. In this way, the Marcos-era economic boom was double-edged. It created wealth for corporations and settlers, while deepening poverty for indigenous groups like the Subanen. Development, for them, meant exploitation without compensation, displacement without justice. As settlers consolidated control, the Subanen experienced multi-layered marginalization. Economically, they lost access to fertile lands and river systems that had once provided food security, pushed into uplands with rocky soils. Many families struggled with poor harvests and persistent hunger. This economic displacement created a cycle of poverty that trapped generation after generation. Social services deepened the divide. Schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects were built in settler communities, while Subanen villages were often bypassed. As a result, literacy rates among Subanen children lagged behind, and access to healthcare remained limited. This lack of services reinforced stereotypes of the Subanen as backward, a cruel irony since it was state neglect that produced these conditions. Culturally, displacement disrupted traditions. Sacred sites such as burial grounds, rivers, and groves were fenced off or destroyed by plantations, logging, or mining. Without access to these places, rituals became harder to perform, weakening cultural continuity. Settlers, meanwhile, often dismissed Subanen spiritual beliefs as superstition. Over time, younger generations faced a dilemma: hold on to traditions while living in increasingly marginalized spaces, or assimilate into settler culture at the cost of identity. This erosion was not accidental. It was a consequence of policies that prioritized settlers over natives. By the 1980s, the Subanen had become both economically impoverished and culturally endangered, surviving on the fringes of a society that had once been theirs. The demographic and social shifts of the 1970s and 1980s also coincided with rising conflicts in Mindanao. Martial law militarized the island, as Marcos's government sought to suppress Moro secessionist movements and communist insurgencies. The Subanen, though not central to these conflicts, were often caught in the crossfire. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were harassed by the military, while rebel groups sometimes pressured Subanen communities for support. This double pressure created insecurity, forcing many to abandon their homes and seek safety deeper in the mountains. At the same time, resistance among Lumad groups, including the Subanen, grew. Activists began linking indigenous struggles with broader movements for land reform and human rights. Some Subanen leaders started speaking out against logging and mining concessions that displaced their communities. However, under martial law, such activism was dangerous. Leaders were often arrested, branded as insurgents, or silenced. Despite the risks, cultural resilience became a form of survival. The Subanen maintained rituals, oral histories, and communal gatherings as acts of defiance against erasure. They reminded their children that even if the state ignored them, their ancestors had walked the rivers and valleys long before settlers arrived. These stories nurtured hope that one day, justice might be restored. The 1980s were thus a paradoxical era, one of deepened marginalization, but also of seeds of resistance. Though weakened by displacement and conflict, the Subanen spirit endured, setting the stage for later movements that would demand recognition of indigenous rights in the post-Marcos years. In 1986, after more than 2 decades of authoritarian rule, the Marcos dictatorship collapsed under the weight of corruption, repression, and popular unrest. The People Power Revolution in Manila captured global attention as millions of Filipinos peacefully ousted Marcos and installed Corazon Aquino as the new president. For many in Luzon and Visayas, it was a moment of triumph, a restoration of democracy and hope. But for the Subanen and the Zamboanga Peninsula, the change in leadership did not immediately transform their daily struggles. While the fall of Marcos ended martial law and its harshest military abuses, the structures that marginalized the Subanen remained intact. Settlers still dominated lowland towns. Logging and mining concessions continued to operate, and government services were concentrated in settler communities rather than upland villages. Yet the 1986 transition did create opportunities. For the first time in decades, indigenous leaders could speak more freely without the same fear of martial law repression. Civil society organizations, many of which had opposed Marcos, began extending support to Lumad groups. NGOs and church-based organizations, particularly in Mindanao, started documenting land grabs, human rights violations, and the struggles of indigenous communities. The Subanen, though still marginalized, now had allies and wider advocacy networks. The fall of Marcos did not end dispossession, but it opened political space for the Subanen to begin articulating their grievances in a newly restored democratic system. One of the most significant outcomes of the post-Marcos period was the drafting of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. For the first time in history, the rights of indigenous cultural communities were explicitly recognized in the nation's charter. Article 12, Section 5 declared that the state shall protect the rights of indigenous cultural communities to their ancestral lands to ensure their economic, social, and cultural well-being. Article 14, Section 17 emphasized the importance of preserving indigenous cultures, traditions, and institutions. These provisions were groundbreaking because they acknowledged what had been denied for so long, that indigenous groups like the Subanen had legitimate claims to their ancestral domains. However, constitutional recognition did not automatically translate into immediate land restitution. Implementing these rights required further legislation, which would take another decade to materialize in the form of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997. Still, the inclusion of indigenous rights in the Constitution gave Subanen communities a legal foundation to assert their claims. For the first time, they could argue not only from moral or historical grounds, but also from constitutional law. Advocacy groups used this recognition to pressure the government into halting destructive projects and acknowledging indigenous consent. Although challenges remained immense, the Subanen could now begin to reframe their identity, not as squatters on public land, but as rightful stewards of ancestral domains guaranteed by the nation's highest law. The years following Marcos's fall saw the gradual rise of indigenous advocacy movements across Mindanao, and the Subanen were part of this awakening. With democratic space reopening, Subanen leaders, often supported by NGOs, church groups, and progressive lawyers, began organizing to resist further displacement. They held community assemblies to document oral histories of land ownership, reaffirming their ties to rivers, valleys, and forests. They sent petitions to local governments, demanding recognition of their ancestral domains. Some communities also joined broader Lumad movements that advocated for land rights, self-determination, and cultural survival. Resistance was not only political, but also cultural. Rituals, dances, and oral storytelling were revitalized as ways of keeping identity alive. By asserting culture, the Subanen were asserting land because their rituals were inseparable from the places they honored. However, advocacy also came with risks. Mining and logging companies continued to expand, often with local politicians as allies. Subanen leaders who opposed these projects sometimes faced harassment or violence. Despite this, the 1980s and early 1990s were crucial for planting the seeds of long-term struggle. For the first time in decades, the Subanen were not completely silenced. They had platforms, allies, and constitutional backing. Though far from achieving justice, they had begun to move from invisibility toward visibility, from silence toward organized resistance. This fragile but important shift laid the groundwork for the landmark Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act that would be passed in 1997, a law that promised, at least on paper, to restore dignity and land to communities like the Subanen. By the early 1990s, Indigenous movements across the Philippines had gained significant traction. Years of organizing, advocacy, and alliance building were beginning to bear fruit. Lumad groups in Mindanao, including the Subanen, had built networks with church-based organizations, human rights groups, and environmental activists. Their struggles were increasingly visible at the national level. Land dispossession, once considered an invisible problem confined to rural Mindanao, was now being discussed in the halls of Congress and in the media. Several events accelerated this momentum. First, the continuing expansion of mining and logging concessions brought widespread destruction to ancestral domains, sparking protests not only from indigenous groups, but also from environmental movements. Second, the 1987 Constitution's recognition of indigenous rights created a legal and moral basis for passing more detailed legislation. Lawmakers sympathetic to indigenous struggles began drafting bills that would go beyond vague constitutional guarantees. After years of debate, the result was the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, Republic Act 8371, signed into law in October 1997. IPRA was groundbreaking because it went further than any previous policy. It recognized the concept of ancestral domain as a collective right of indigenous peoples. For the Subanen, this was historic. After nearly a century of being treated as squatters on their own land, they now had a legal instrument that affirmed what they had always known, that their rivers, mountains, and valleys belonged to them by heritage, not by paper titles imposed by outsiders. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act was comprehensive in scope. It recognized 4 bundles of rights for indigenous cultural communities. 1. Rights to ancestral domains. 2. Rights to self-governance. 3. Rights to social justice and human rights. And 4. Rights to cultural integrity. The first was most significant for the Subanen. IPRA allowed them to apply for certificates of ancestral domain title, CADs, which would grant legal recognition to territories traditionally occupied and used by their communities. Unlike earlier homestead laws, which individualized land ownership, IPRA respected the collective nature of indigenous tenure. It also established the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, as the primary agency to implement the law. For the Subanen, this opened the door to reclaiming lands they had lost under the Public Land Act of 1903 and subsequent settlement programs. However, the process was not simple. Applying for a CADT required mapping territories, documenting oral histories, and going through bureaucratic processes that were often lengthy and costly. Moreover, the law included provisions requiring free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, before any project could proceed in ancestral domains. This was designed to prevent mining or logging companies from exploiting indigenous lands without community approval. For the Subanen, this was a powerful tool. In principle, it meant that corporations could no longer simply bulldoze into their forests or valleys without their consent. Yet, while the law looked promising on paper, the reality of its implementation was much more complicated and often disappointing. Despite its historic promises, IPRA's implementation was plagued with problems. For the Subanen, several barriers stood in the way. First, the process of securing a CADT was bureaucratic and expensive. Many Subanen communities lacked the resources, technical expertise, or political connections needed to navigate NCIP's requirements. Second, vested interests resisted the law. Local politicians, settlers, and corporations often opposed CADT applications, fearing that their landholdings or concessions would be reduced. In some cases, they used intimidation or legal loopholes to block indigenous claims. Third, the state's contradictory policies undermined IPRA. While the law recognized ancestral domains, the government simultaneously promoted mining and agribusiness under neoliberal economic policies in the 1990s. The Philippines Mining Act of 1995, passed just 2 years before IPRA, opened vast tracts of land to foreign mining companies, including areas claimed by indigenous groups. This created a clash between pro-indigenous and pro-corporate laws. For the Subanen, it meant that even as they filed ceded claims, they faced threats of displacement from mining projects. One of the most controversial examples was the Quinachuan mine in Zamboanga del Norte, where Subanen communities were divided and displaced despite IPRA's supposed protections. By the end of the 1990s, many Subanen realized that legal recognition was only the beginning. Without strong enforcement and genuine respect from state and corporate actors, IPRA could not by itself stop dispossession. Still, the law gave them a platform to assert their rights, turning centuries of marginalization into a legal battle for recognition. It was not the end of their struggle, but it was a significant milestone in the long history of reclaiming what was theirs. The dawn of the 21st century brought new challenges for the Subanen. While the 1997 Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, had promised protection of ancestral domains, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. In the 2000s, the Philippine government aggressively pursued mining as a national development strategy, hoping to attract foreign investment and increase export revenues. This was largely driven by the Philippine Mining Act of 1995, which allowed 100% foreign ownership of mining projects and offered generous incentives to companies. Mindanao, rich in gold, copper, and other minerals, became one of the prime targets for this expansion. In Zamboanga Peninsula, Subanen territories overlapped with identified mining zones, and the government began granting permits to multinational and local corporations. The rhetoric was familiar. Mining was portrayed as a driver of progress, a source of jobs, and a way to modernize the countryside. But for the Subanen, it meant another wave of dispossession. Forests that had sustained them for generations were marked for open-pit mining. Rivers that provided food and water risked contamination from toxic chemicals like cyanide and mercury. The concept of free, prior, and informed consent, FPSC, enshrined in IPRA, was often manipulated. Companies would divide communities by offering gifts or benefits to some leaders while sidelining dissenting voices. What was supposed to be a safeguard for indigenous rights became, in practice, a tool of co-optation. The Subanen soon found themselves not only marginalized by settlers, but also under siege from powerful corporate interests backed by state policy. Among the most infamous mining conflicts involving the Subanen was the Quinachuan mine in Zamboanga del Norte. Operated initially by the Canadian company TVI Pacific, the project became a symbol of how indigenous rights could be trampled despite legal protections. The Quinachuan area was sacred to many Subanen. It was the site of rituals, burial grounds, and spiritual connections passed down through generations. Yet in the early 2000s, the company secured permits to mine gold and copper there, claiming to have obtained FPIC from the community. In reality, the process was deeply flawed. Reports from NGOs and church groups documented how the company exploited divisions within the Subanen. Some leaders offered benefits or employment, signed agreements, while others who opposed the project were sidelined or branded as troublemakers. As the mine expanded, sacred sites were bulldozed and villages were displaced. Rivers became polluted and farmland was destroyed. The conflict tore through Subanen communities, dividing families and weakening traditional authority. Those who resisted faced harassment and intimidation, sometimes from private security forces allied with the company. The Quinachuan case became a rallying point for indigenous rights advocates across the Philippines and internationally. It exposed the gap between the promises of IPRA and the realities of its implementation. For the Subanen, it was another painful reminder that legal recognition of ancestral domains meant little when corporations and the state prioritized profit over people. The 2000s were not only about mining conflicts. They were also about the broader struggle to protect the environment and Subanen culture. Logging, though less dominant than in earlier decades, continued to threaten forests, while agricultural expansion encroached on upland areas. Climate change added new pressures, with unpredictable rainfall and stronger typhoons making subsistence farming even more precarious. In this context, many Subanen communities doubled down on cultural resilience as a form of resistance. Rituals tied to rivers, forests, and mountains became more than spiritual practices. They became political statements asserting that the land was sacred and not for sale. Storytelling traditions emphasized ancestral connections, reminding younger generations of their duty to protect the land. At the same time, alliances grew stronger. NGOs, environmental groups, and church networks amplified Subanen voices in national and international forums. Campaigns highlighted the injustice of mining in ancestral domains, framing it as both a human rights issue and an environmental crisis. Yet challenges persisted. Local politicians often sided with corporations, settlers continued to dominate politics, and many Subanen remained trapped in poverty. The fight for ancestral domains was thus not only about reclaiming land, but also about asserting dignity, culture, and survival in the face of systemic neglect. By the end of the 2000s, the Subanen struggle had become emblematic of the broader conflict between indigenous rights and state-backed corporate interests in the Philippines. Their story showed that laws alone could not guarantee justice without genuine respect for indigenous sovereignty. By the 2010s, the Subanen had already endured over a century of dispossession, but their struggle for ancestral domains remained far from over. Despite the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, being in place since 1997, many Subanen communities still did not hold certificates of ancestral domain title CATs. Bureaucratic delays, corruption, and political interference slowed the process. In some cases, Subanen groups were pitted against each other, as corporations or politicians used divide-and-rule tactics to weaken collective resistance. The overlap between ancestral domain claims and existing land titles issued to settlers created endless conflicts. Meanwhile, mining and agribusiness projects continued to encroach on Subanen territories, often justified by the state as development. For example, palm oil plantations expanded in Zamboanga del Norte and Misamis Occidental, threatening biodiversity and food security. To the Subanen, these expansions meant not only ecological damage, but also the erasure of cultural sites and burial grounds. Younger generations faced the risk of growing up disconnected from their heritage, as sacred places were fenced off or destroyed. Yet, despite these challenges, the 2010s also saw a renewed determination. Communities began using modern tools such as participatory mapping, legal documentation, and advocacy campaigns to strengthen their ceded applications. With support from NGOs and church-based groups, the Subanen reframed their struggle as not just a local issue, but part of a broader national and global fight for indigenous rights. The 2010s were also defined by peace negotiations between the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, culminating in the 2014 signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, CB. While this agreement primarily addressed the rights and governance of Moro peoples, it also had implications for Lumad groups like the Subanen. Many Subanen communities lived in areas that overlapped with territories claimed by Moro groups or included in the proposed Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. This created both opportunities and tensions. On the one hand, the peace process highlighted the historical injustices faced by non-dominant peoples in Mindanao, giving visibility to the idea of ancestral domain and self-determination. On the other hand, Subanen leaders worried that their own claims might be overshadowed by the larger Moro struggle. Some Subanen feared being caught between competing sovereignties, the national government, the Bangsamoro government, and local settler-dominated politics. In response, Subanen organizations emphasized the need for distinct recognition of Lumad rights, separate from both settler and Moro claims. They insisted that while they supported peace, They would not allow their ancestral lands to be bargained away in political negotiations. This period also saw alliances forming between Lumad and Moro groups in resisting mining and militarization, recognizing that their struggles, though different, were rooted in common experiences of dispossession. For the Subanen, the peace process was a reminder that their voice needed to be heard in any discussion about the future of Mindanao. Amid ongoing conflicts over land and governance, the 2010s also witnessed a wave of cultural revitalization among the Subanen. Recognizing that land rights and cultural survival were intertwined, community leaders placed new emphasis on preserving rituals, music, dances, and oral histories. Festivals and community gatherings were used not only as celebrations, but as acts of resistance, reminding both settlers and younger Subanen of their deep connection to the land. Education became another front of struggle. Some Subanen communities, with the help of NGOs, established Lumad schools designed to teach both formal subjects and indigenous knowledge. These schools taught children how to read and write, but also how to value their heritage, farm sustainably, and understand their rights under IPRA. However, these schools were often red-tagged by the military, accused of being influenced by insurgents. This harassment showed how even cultural and educational initiatives were politicized. At the same time, Subanen leaders participated in national and international indigenous rights forums, linking their struggles with global movements such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. They used platforms like social media to amplify their voices, showing the world that the Subanen were not relics of the past, but active participants in contemporary struggles for justice. By the end of the 2010s, the Subanen were more organized, visible, and assertive than ever, even if their challenges remained daunting. Their survival was no longer just about defending land. It was about keeping alive a culture and identity in the face of systemic pressures to assimilate or disappear. Amid ongoing conflicts over land and governance, the 2010s also witnessed a wave of cultural revitalization among the Subanen. Recognizing that land rights and cultural survival were intertwined, community leaders placed new emphasis on preserving rituals, music, dances, and oral histories. Festivals and community gatherings were used not only as celebrations, but as acts of resistance, reminding both settlers and younger Subanen of their deep connection to the land. Education became another front of struggle. Some Subanen communities, with the help of NGOs, established Lumad schools designed to teach both formal subjects and indigenous knowledge. These schools taught children how to read and write, but also how to value their heritage, farm sustainably, and understand their rights under IPRA. However, these schools were often red-tagged by the military, accused of being influenced by insurgents. This harassment showed how even cultural and educational initiatives were politicized. At the same time, Subanen leaders participated in national and international indigenous rights forums, linking their struggles with global movements such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. They used platforms like social media to amplify their voices, showing the world that the Subanen were not relics of the past, but active participants in contemporary struggles for justice. By the end of the 2010s, the Subanen were more organized, visible, and assertive than ever, even if their challenges remained daunting. Their survival was no longer just about defending land. It was about keeping alive a culture and identity in the face of systemic pressures to assimilate or disappear. As the world entered the 2020s, climate change emerged as one of the most pressing issues affecting indigenous communities, and the Subanen were no exception. The Zamboanga Peninsula, once lush with forests and fertile rivers, began experiencing increasingly erratic weather patterns. Typhoons grew stronger, floods became more frequent, and droughts lasted longer. For the Subanen, who relied heavily on small-scale agriculture and forest resources, these shifts were devastating. Crops that once grew reliably along riverbanks withered in the heat or were swept away by sudden floods. Water sources became less predictable, with rivers sometimes drying up during the summer and overflowing dangerously during the rainy season. Climate change also intensified the ecological damage caused by decades of logging and mining. Areas where forests had been cleared were now more prone to landslides, burying villages and farms. For people already pushed to the margins, climate change magnified their vulnerability. Yet, the Subanen were not passive victims. Many elders emphasized traditional ecological knowledge, teaching younger generations sustainable farming practices, seed preservation, and watershed protection. These practices, passed down orally, became tools for climate resilience. However, while their knowledge provided local solutions, larger systemic problems remained. Government disaster responses often prioritized urban centers and settler communities, leaving upland indigenous villages with minimal assistance. This imbalance reinforced the feeling that the Subanen were once again invisible in national priorities, even as they stood at the front lines of environmental crises. Climate change became not only an ecological issue, but also a social justice issue for the Subanen, adding another layer of struggle to their already complex history of dispossession. Despite global conversations about sustainability, the Philippine government in the 2020s continued to promote extractive industries, particularly mining and large-scale agribusiness. The Subanen territories, rich in mineral deposits, remained prime targets for these ventures. New mining applications were filed in Zamboanga del Norte and Misamis Occidental, reviving old wounds from the Quechuan controversy. Palm oil plantations also expanded, marketed as sources of renewable energy and economic growth. These projects, however, often came at the cost of Subanen ancestral lands. Once again, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, was undermined. Companies held consultations that were poorly attended, manipulated outcomes, or secured signatures from only a few individuals rather than entire communities. Resistance persisted, but it came with risks. Subanen leaders who opposed mining or plantations reported harassment, red tagging, and even threats to their lives. In some cases, military or paramilitary groups were deployed to secure project areas, heightening tensions. The Subanen faced a dilemma: participate in negotiations that were often biased in favor of corporations, or risk being excluded entirely. At the same time, the destruction of forests and watersheds threatened not only their livelihoods, but also their cultural identity. Sacred sites were once again endangered, and ancestral rivers faced pollution. These struggles highlighted a painful truth. Despite legal protections under IPRA and international frameworks like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, on DRIP, the gap between rights on paper and reality on the ground remained enormous. For the Subanen, the 2020s became a continuation of a centuries-old battle. Only now the stakes included not just land, but also survival in the face of global environmental crises. One of the most inspiring developments of the 2020s has been the rise of Subanen youth activism. Recognizing the fragility of their future, younger generations began taking leadership roles in defending land and culture. Many Subanen youth pursued education in universities in Mindanao and even Manila, returning to their communities with skills in law, social sciences, and environmental management. Armed with both traditional knowledge and modern tools, they became bridges between their elders and the wider world. Social media platforms amplified their voices, allowing them to share stories of dispossession, cultural resilience, and environmental advocacy with national and global audiences. Campaigns against destructive mining projects or deforestation gained traction online, drawing solidarity from other indigenous groups, environmental activists, and international allies. At the same time, Subanen youth revitalized cultural practices, incorporating traditional music, weaving, and rituals into contemporary expressions of identity. For them, culture was not just heritage, but a living form of resistance. However, activism also came with risks. Youth leaders were sometimes accused of being influenced by insurgents, echoing old patterns of red tagging. Others faced the challenge of balancing modern education with the expectations of elders who value tradition. Despite these tensions, Subanen youth emerged as crucial defenders of ancestral domains. They carried the memory of centuries of injustice, but also the hope of renewal. Their message was clear: the Subanen will not vanish. Instead, they will adapt, resist, and continue fighting for their rightful place in the Zamboanga Peninsula. In their voices, the struggle of the past converged with the aspirations of the future. The Subanen are part of the larger group of non-Muslim indigenous peoples in Mindanao, collectively referred to as the Lumad. By the 2020s, the Lumad movement had become one of the most organized indigenous struggles in the Philippines, demanding recognition of ancestral domains, respect for self-determination, and an end to militarization. For decades, Lumad groups have been stereotyped as fragmented and powerless, but the reality was different. Through federations, alliances, and advocacy groups, they forged a collective voice. The Subanen contributed to this movement, bringing their own experiences of land dispossession, cultural erosion, and mining conflicts to the table. Within Lumad assemblies, Subanen leaders shared stories of sacred rivers threatened by mining, valleys lost to settlers, and forests logged by corporations. Their testimony resonated with the experiences of the Manobo, Higanon, Tejere, and others, showing that although each Lumad group had unique histories, they faced the same structural injustices. Together, they advocated not only for land rights, but also for broader issues such as environmental justice, education, and human rights. For the Subanen, being part of the Lumad movement meant that they were no longer isolated victims, but participants in a larger, united struggle. This collective identity strengthened their resilience, reminding them that their history of displacement was part of a wider pattern of colonialism and state neglect, and therefore required solidarity across groups to challenge it effectively. The relationship between Lumad groups, like the Subanen and Moro communities, has historically been complex. While both suffered dispossession under colonial and post-colonial states, tensions sometimes arose because their ancestral territories overlapped. The creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the late 2010s brought these tensions into sharper focus. Some Subanen worried that their ancestral claims might be overshadowed by Moro political structures, while Moro leaders emphasized their own history of marginalization. Yet despite these differences, the 2020s also saw new efforts at alliance building. Subanen leaders joined dialogues with Moro groups to discuss shared concerns: protection of ancestral domains, resistance to destructive industries, and demilitarization of Mindanao. These alliances recognized that both Lumad and Moro peoples were facing similar threats from state-backed corporations, large-scale agribusiness, and mining ventures. Joint campaigns highlighted how development projects often ignored the consent of both groups, treating their lands as empty spaces for exploitation. The Subanen, in particular, emphasized that peace in Mindanao could not be achieved if indigenous voices were excluded from decision-making. Through these partnerships, they gained visibility and showed that indigenous and Moro struggles were not mutually exclusive but interconnected. While challenges remained, such as overlapping land claims and historical grievances, these alliances marked a step toward unity in diversity. For the Subanen, cooperation with Moro groups offered not only solidarity, but also a stronger bargaining position in negotiations with the state and corporations. By the 2020s, the Subanen were no longer confined to local struggles. Their voices began to echo on national and international stages. Subanen representatives participated in forums organized by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, and international networks advocating for the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. Through these platforms, they connected their story with global narratives of indigenous dispossession, climate justice, and resistance to extractivism. They shared how, despite having IPRA in the Philippines, enforcement remained weak, and companies continued to violate the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. International solidarity brought visibility and sometimes funding for local projects, such as community schools, sustainable agriculture, and cultural revitalization programs. On a national level, The Subanen worked with other Lumad and Indigenous groups to lobby Congress, engage the courts, and push for stricter implementation of IPRA. They also joined protest movements, bringing their chants, dances, and cultural symbols to rallies in Manila and other cities. These acts were not just political, but also cultural affirmations, demonstrations that the Subanen were alive, visible, and unwilling to be erased. However, advocacy also carried risks. Leaders who gained visibility sometimes faced harassment or threats from those who saw Indigenous empowerment as a threat to mining or agribusiness interests. Yet, despite these dangers, the Subanen continued to step forward, showing the world that their story was part of a broader struggle for Indigenous dignity. By situating themselves in both national and international movements, the Subanen transformed from marginalized voices into important contributors to global Indigenous advocacy. In the 2020s, technology has become both a challenge and an opportunity for the Subanen. In earlier decades, many of their upland villages were isolated, connected only by dirt roads or footpaths. Today, cell phones and internet access, though limited, are reaching more Subanen communities. Young people in particular have embraced mobile technology and social media as tools for connection and advocacy. Through platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and even TikTok, Subanen youth share stories, document cultural rituals, and expose injustices such as mining incursions or environmental destruction. Technology has allowed them to bypass traditional gatekeepers of information, bringing their narratives directly to wider audiences. However, this new connectivity also presents risks. On one hand, it helps spread awareness and empowers communities to link with NGOs and allies across the Philippines and abroad. On the other hand, it exposes Subanen youth to cultural dilution, consumerist lifestyles, and pressures to assimilate into mainstream society. The elders worry that the constant exposure to settler culture via digital platforms may weaken younger generations' connection to oral traditions, rituals, and ecological knowledge. Still, technology is not inherently negative. Some communities have creatively integrated it into cultural survival. For instance, elders are being recorded on video as they recite oral histories, ensuring that their wisdom is preserved for future generations. In this way, the Subanen are attempting to use technology on their own terms, not to erase their culture, but to protect and amplify it in the face of ongoing change. Education has always been a double-edged sword for the Subanen. For decades, public schools were built primarily in settler communities, leaving Indigenous children with little access. Those who did attend often encountered a curriculum that ignored or even disparaged their culture, teaching them that progress meant leaving behind Indigenous traditions. This created a painful dynamic. Education opened opportunities for mobility, but at the cost of assimilation. In the 2000s and 2010s, however, the rise of Lumad schools began to shift this pattern. Subanen communities, with the help of church groups and NGOs, established schools that combined formal education with Indigenous knowledge systems. Children learned reading, writing, and mathematics, but also farming techniques suited to upland soils, rituals tied to the seasons, and histories of their people that were absent from state textbooks. These schools became hubs of cultural pride and political awareness. Yet they faced immense challenges. Some were accused of being influenced by insurgents and subjected to harassment by security forces. Teachers were threatened, and schools were occasionally shut down. Despite these dangers, many Subanen families saw the value of these institutions. By the 2020s, an increasing number of Subanen youth were completing higher education, returning as lawyers, teachers, and environmental advocates. Education became not only a ladder for personal advancement, but also a tool for collective survival. By blending Indigenous and modern knowledge, the Subanen were redefining what education meant. Not an erasure of tradition, but an empowerment rooted in identity. For the Subanen, the greatest challenge of the present is not simply external threats like mining or displacement, but the internal tension between preserving tradition and engaging with modernity. Elders emphasize the importance of rituals, oral storytelling, and respect for sacred places, seeing them as the foundation of identity. Youth, however, live in a world where survival often requires navigating settler-dominated economies, mastering digital tools, and pursuing higher education. This creates generational debates. Should young Subanen prioritize cultural preservation or modern advancement? The truth, as many leaders have recognized, is that survival requires both. Tradition provides a moral compass, ecological wisdom, and cultural strength, while modernity offers tools, education, and political leverage. Communities are experimenting with ways to strike this balance. Some combine rituals with environmental advocacy campaigns, framing traditional ceremonies as expressions of ecological stewardship. Others integrate indigenous art forms into contemporary performances, showing that culture can adapt without disappearing. The challenge is ongoing, and there is no simple solution. What is clear is that the Subanen cannot afford to retreat entirely into tradition, nor can they assimilate fully into modernity without losing their soul. Their path forward lies in creatively blending both, ensuring that each new generation remembers who they are while also equipping themselves to face the future. In this balancing act, the Subanen embody resilience. They show that indigenous identity is not static but evolving, capable of confronting modern challenges while remaining rooted in ancestral memory. Looking back across more than a century of history, the story of the Subanen is one of profound dispossession, but also of survival. From the time of the Treaty of Paris in 1898, when their lands were handed over by Spain to the United States without their knowledge or consent, to the Public Land Act of 1903, which stripped them of ancestral ownership in favor of settler titles, the Subanen endured a relentless pattern of marginalization. The Commonwealth period under Quezon institutionalized resettlement through the National Land Settlement Administration, 1939, bringing thousands of Luzon and Visayan settlers into Mindanao. After independence, presidents like Roxas, Magsaysay, and Marcos continued and even intensified these programs, portraying Mindanao as an empty frontier despite the reality of indigenous occupation. Each decade layered new wounds. Settlers outnumbered them in their own homeland. Logging and mining concessions carved up their forests, and plantations pushed them further into the mountains. By the late 20th century, the Subanen were labeled squatters on their own soil, a cruel irony given their centuries of stewardship. Yet throughout this long history of loss, the Subanen did not vanish. They retreated, adapted, resisted, and reasserted their identity in the face of overwhelming odds. Their survival was not passive. It was the result of cultural resilience, communal solidarity, and the determination to hold on to their sacred rivers, mountains, and rituals even when the law denied their existence. Their endurance is a testimony to the strength of indigenous peoples across the world who refuse to be erased by the machinery of colonialism and modernity. The Subanen's history carries powerful moral lessons that extend far beyond the Zamboanga Peninsula. First, it reveals the deep injustice of defining ownership solely through Western legal concepts like written land titles. For the Subanen, land was never property. It was a shared heritage sustained by ancestors and passed on to future generations. To deny that heritage simply because it was not written on paper is to deny their humanity and worldview. Second, their story shows how development, when imposed without consent, can become another form of violence. Programs that were celebrated as nation-building or poverty alleviation, such as homestead settlements or plantations, often enriched settlers and corporations at the expense of indigenous peoples. For the Subanen, development frequently meant displacement. Third, their history illustrates the importance of indigenous rights as human rights. Modern frameworks like the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, IPRA, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, exist precisely because of centuries of injustice faced by groups like the Subanen. These instruments remind us that justice is not charity, but recognition of rights that were always there. Finally, Their story is a moral call to reimagine how societies value land and culture. The Subanen remind us that land is not just a commodity to be exploited. It is a living entity tied to identity, memory, and survival. Their struggle challenges us to rethink what justice, development, and democracy truly mean in a diverse society. As the Subanen move further into the 21st century, their future remains uncertain, but also filled with possibility. Climate change, mining, and agribusiness continue to threaten their lands, while poverty and marginalization remain pressing challenges. Yet, there are also reasons for hope. Subanen youth are rising as leaders, blending traditional knowledge with modern education and using technology to amplify their voices. Communities are revitalizing rituals and oral histories, ensuring that identity is not lost. Legal tools like IP array, though imperfect, provide a foundation for asserting ancestral domain claims. Alliances with other Lumad groups, Moro communities, NGOs, and international networks are strengthening their struggle. In this sense, the Subanen are not relics of the past, but active participants in shaping the future of Mindanao and the Philippines. Their story must be remembered not only as a tale of loss, but also as a narrative of resilience. For viewers, students, and citizens who encounter the Subanen's history, the call is clear: to support Indigenous rights, to honor cultural diversity, and to ensure that justice is not delayed any further. The Subanen may have been pushed into the mountains, but their voice echoes across history, demanding recognition. They stand as living proof that even after centuries of dispossession, a people can endure, resist, and reassert their rightful place in the world. Their journey reminds us that history is not just about the past. It is also about the choices we make today and the futures we allow to unfold. You have just traveled through more than a century of history, the story of how the Subanen, the first people of the Zamboanga Peninsula, lost much of their homeland. We saw how the Treaty of Paris of 1898 erased their voice, how the Public Land Act of 1903 declared their ancestral lands as public property, how the National Land Settlement Administration brought waves of settlers to Mindanao, and how post-independence leaders continued programs that favored outsiders over natives. We saw their struggles during the Marcos years, the mining conflicts of the 2000s, and the rise of Subanen youth activism in the 2020s. Most importantly, we learned the moral of their story, that justice delayed is injustice prolonged, and that ancestral rights cannot be erased by laws written on paper. Their resilience teaches us that land is not just soil. It is identity, memory, and life itself. As you close this chapter, remember the Subanen, and remember that history is never just about the past. It shapes who we are today and who we may become tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this journey here on History Teller YT. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe, share, and return for more histories that deserve to be heard. Until next time, let us carry forward the lesson of the Subanen, that the fight for dignity, land, and culture is a fight worth continuing. Asterisk.